And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, recognised by Euromoney Cash Management Survey 2024 for pioneering cash management solutions for their clients. Good evening. Welcome to the programme. I'm Stephen Grootes. Well, again, a sort of very busy day on markets, and the lack of people drinking beer, or the lack of beer being drunk, I should say, in markets like Mexico, the US and China having a big impact on AB InBev. We'll talk about that with some market commentary later tonight. The story that really caught my eye, though, is actually happening in the European Union, and it involves Temu. Temu, of course, the online retailer that sell clothes, all sorts of other things. Google anything and price, and you'll get a hit from Temu, basically, them and Shein, but particularly Temu. And the EU, it seems, is suggesting that they're going to investigate Temu, firstly, because they might be allowing the sale of illegal goods. Okay, I mean, this happens on online platforms, all well and good. But then they also say, for potentially addictive design. I had to scratch my head at that. I don't think I've ever heard that phrase before. Potentially addictive design. And then it sort of struck me that actually maybe what the problem is here is the way that interface works. It's a bit like gambling, you know, you sort of get kind of rewards and things like that. Maybe it's not quite gambling because you get what you pay for, supposedly, but it's kind of close. You're sort of playing a game. And this issue around addiction in games is becoming more and more of an issue. If you have teenage children, and I use the phrase fortnight, you know exactly what I mean when I talk about that and how powerful these things can be. There's no chemical here, but there's still a chemical being released in your brain. And the point I'm trying to get to is, it does seem to me that we are going to see all sorts of real science, and we're seeing it already, being used in the design of websites. And that's going to be where online retailers now surely compete. It's not so much in price, but in how you get this addiction going. It's an astonishing development, one I would not have predicted, a couple of years ago. And I can't help but wonder how that is going to end. But the idea of playing while you are buying becomes enormously powerful. And I think that sort of interface is going to be very interesting to see how people compete. We'll talk a little bit to the World Gold Council later in the program, around half an hour from now, and particularly around what is happening. And I'm fascinated by this. So they say that the world global demand for gold is up by 5% year on year, which actually, if you think about it, is huge. I mean, we're already talking about strong demand, but up by 5%, that's huge. And everyone's talking about gold as a safe haven status. And that takes us immediately to the US election. And I just want to reiterate my comment and my sort of view on things in the US right now is that it seems very unlikely to me that we have the US election Tuesday, sort of Wednesday, our time next week, and 24 hours later we have an outcome. I mean, we might, but it doesn't seem likely. And I just worry a little bit about the political temperature in that country, and that, in fact, what we might end up with is 2 to 3 weeks of real uncertainty, perhaps even longer than that. And that could lead to all sorts of problems in the US. And I think that is going to be a major, major issue. And that will have an impact on the gold price. And that, I think, is going to be very interesting to watch. And one other note, if I may, with City Power, you may remember we spoke to the DA in Joburg about City Power, about what the DA claims is a policy to cut off people who don't buy enough prepaid electricity regularly enough. It would seem, I thought, to punish people who pay too much in advance. City Power, as I understand it, denies that. We were speaking to them this morning. We did make contact. We wanted to give them a right of reply. We didn't do it yesterday because of the medium-term budget policy statement. We still are waiting for someone to be available for an interview. It can take some time. May happen tomorrow, may happen Monday, but we're kind of hoping that will happen in the next couple of days. And a couple of questions to put to City Power around prepaid, around postpaid, around solar installations. There's actually a lot going on with billing around City Power at the moment, and I think that is going to be quite an important conversation. So just to update you on that, we are still trying and hoping that we will in fact be able to speak to City Power in the next couple of days and just get a response. We also owe them, of course, a right of reply, really, don't we, to what actually happened and what was said on the radio a couple of days ago. That would have been Tuesday that we've been looking at. There's been another comment in the last sort of 24 hours or so from two people I think I respect immensely. Wandile Seklobo and Professor Johan Kirsten. They've been talking about the lack of money that is being spent on research in agriculture. And I have a couple of questions. We'll hear from them a little later in the program. But one of them is, where would you spend the money? Where I'm really going with this is, what is hot in agricultural research right now? And I think this, we know that research in agriculture usually leads to more food, usually leads to, basically cheaper food as well. I think this is a very important story. About an hour from now, we expect to be able to bring you that. And we'll speak to Professor Johan Kirsten in just a moment. You're with The Money Show, 13 minutes after 6.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702
1702.
Well, the dust beginning to clear a little bit after the medium-term budget policy statement from yesterday. And confirmation of the huge impact debt is having on us, confirmation of the lower revenues from tax, and then what I think was an important number, that we only expected to grow our economy by 1.8% over the medium term, less than that in the sort of next year. Last night you heard from various experts, commentators about what was announced tonight, the turn of the National Treasury. The Director General of the National Treasury is Dr. Duncan Pieterse. Duncan, good evening. I can't imagine that you've had any time to rest since yesterday, so I really appreciate the time. I need to start, I'm afraid, with the claims of austerity that are made against the National Treasury. The Basic Education Minister, I think it was, but certainly the Western Cape Provincial Government, other provinces have said they have to cut the number of teachers because they're not getting enough money to employ the teachers they used to employ. They claim the National Treasury is implementing austerity measures. I understand that you as the National Treasury and the Minister deny that. How would you describe the policy you are implementing?
Good evening, Stephen, and to your listeners as well. We've been quite clear that when you have an economy that is growing, at least over the last few years, at less than 1%, and a population that's growing at around 1.5%, that means that your fiscal position is not sufficient to cater for the various needs that you may have from a service delivery perspective. And so that's why over the last few years we've embarked on what we call fiscal consolidation, which is how do you get your fiscal framework to a point where the debt service costs are no longer continuously crowding out other important service delivery obligations like health and education. Having said that, it's important to note that in the budget earlier this year, we did reverse some of the cuts that we made to provincial health and education budgets. We did allocate to health and education in provinces via the provincial equitable share, and a total of 4.2 billion was not allocated to the wage bills of various provinces, even though the funding was provided. So from our perspective, the budget this year provided the funding required by provinces for health and education. That funding was not directed to where it needs to go. And although there are some historical pressures in provinces, we believe that this MTBPS strikes the right balance going forward, a sustainable fiscal framework while prioritizing critical frontline services.
Okay, so from what you say, would I be right to presume then that a province wouldn't need to cut the number of teachers they have?
Certainly from our analysis and our numbers that we've presented to Cabinet as well as extended Cabinet, that is absolutely correct.
So then why are they saying that they're cutting the number of teachers? Are they not managing their money properly?
In our assessment, Stephen, it's a combination of two things. The one is there are some genuine historical pressures that provinces are struggling to deal with, whether these emanate from the disasters that have occurred, whether these emanate from previous cuts made to budgets, in particular to bail out state-owned entities. However, there's also the second element that I referred to earlier, and that's the element of the fact that through the provincial equitable share, we did make budgets available to cover COE, in particular in health and education. And many provinces did not allocate that funding to health and education compensation of employees. Instead, it was used for other programs, which is, of course, within the rights of provinces because they use their own discretion when they allocate the provincial equitable share.
Okay. I look forward to their response, and I'm sure they'll have one. You also didn't make a provision to introduce a basic income grant, and a basic income grant is not currently government policy. You'll be aware, of course, of all of the commentary and the demands about the SRD grant, the Social Relief of Distress grant. There's actually a court case about it underway in Tshwane at the moment. We're talking about the 370 Rand a month grant. There are strong suggestions it should be made permanent. As the National Treasury, do you believe this is not going to happen? That you're not making any provision for any kind of basic income grant or permanent SRD grant because you don't believe it will happen in this Parliament?
What we have made a provision for, Stephen, is the Social Relief of Distress grant as it stands. So you would know that we have a provisional allocation in the fiscal framework for the Social Relief of Distress grant. And that provisional allocation remains there, and that is part of our planning going forward. A permanent Social Relief of Distress grant or a basic income grant would require us to find significant additional amounts of funding in order to cater for it. So let me give you an example. If the Social Relief of Distress grant were, for example, to be increased by inflation going forward, then we would need another 6.5 billion rand per annum in order to cater for that increase. This means that the Social Relief of Distress grant, depending on the scenario that you run and the amounts by which you increase it, could reach 166 billion per year in 2032, 2033. Against an allocation at the moment of somewhere around 40 billion. And I think the key question that Cabinet and Parliament would have to grapple with is where would the funds for this additional allocation come from, were that decision to be made.
Sure. Okay, I think we hear you. You also decided not to give the state-owned entities any more money. SOEs, some of them do need the money. I'm particularly thinking, Duncan, about the post office. They're not getting a bailout. They had said day zero was yesterday. What are you expecting to happen? I realize it comes under the Communication Minister, Solly Malatsi, but if they didn't get any money from you, I mean, is this the end of the post office?
Stephen, we've been working quite closely with the department and with the Director General there to work on a few different options that we could explore for the needs of the post office. The 3.8 billion that the post office requested consists of about 2 billion rand for recapitalization, infrastructure requirements, and so on. And then the balance of that are payments to creditors and then their Section 189 retrenchment program that they are running. And we are working with the department to see how we can manage that within the baseline of the department, number one, and number two, through partnerships with the private sector and others that we are working with them on. Our challenge, however, is that over the last number of years, we have taken away a lot of resources from frontline services for state-owned entity bailouts. You'll know SAA received about 50 billion. By 25-26, Eskom would have received about 500 billion in bailouts. Transnet last year requested a 61 billion rand bailout. And these are generally taken from frontline services, which is what then results in the province's pressures that I was talking about earlier. So we are trying to resolve the post office matter in a way that does not repeat some of the mistakes in the past, where we are underfunding critical provincial services in order to bail out state-owned entities.
Okay. One of the big problems, obviously, is the wage bill, the government wage bill. You're trying to, and I mean, everyone's been talking a bit about this, although I think it had been sort of announced before. You want to encourage 30,000 senior civil servants to take early retirement. So these are people you wouldn't replace, right? You would be government would lose those posts.
No, Stephen. In fact, these are people that we would replace. Let me first say that this would be a voluntary program, so public civil servants would have to opt in, number one. Number two, the executive authorities and the heads of these departments would have to agree for particular individuals to leave so that they don't lose critical skills. Our assumption at the moment is that about 70% of the individuals that take up early retirement are replaced. That will still result in a saving for the fiscal framework, because typically new people who come into the system enter at lower pay scales and lower notches and would therefore cost less. But the key reason why we're doing it and why departments have requested this is because it's a mechanism to rejuvenate the civil service, and that's why quite a few departments have supported this initiative.
It's quite a comment on 30,000 people, their productivity, that this is happening.
Well, I think there has been quite a lot of interest from individuals in departments themselves to be able to for us to initiate this kind of incentive. So I think part of it is not so much the Department of Public Service and Administration and the National Treasury pushing departments in this direction. It's also departments who have approached us and said our employees are asking for this. Is there a mechanism by which you can incentivize them to exit without having to pay any penalties? And of course, there's quite a lot of research that has been done in, for example, the education sector that demonstrates the positive impacts of an initiative like this on productivity.
Okay. Operation Vulindlela, everyone talks about it. We've been talking about it really for the last 3 months. We've been talking about it for a long time before then, Duncan. And it's supposed to move into a second phase. And included in that phase, everyone talks about this. It's supposed to tackle the dysfunction in local government. And I'm not clear how it's going to do that when it seems to me the problems in local government are political. So as the Treasury, I realize Vulindlela lives in the presidency, but it's very closely aligned to the Treasury. What do you expect Vulindlela to really do about local government?
Yeah, as you know, Stephen, Operation Vulindlela is a joint initiative between the presidency and the National Treasury, and we've been working quite closely for a number of years now on the structural reform agenda. The focus on local government really comes from a lot of the challenges that you would have experienced yourself, perhaps,
Sure.
in that space. What I would say are two things. I think the one is that from a phase 2 perspective, we haven't yet identified the exact reforms, although there is clearly going to be a focus on local government. And as soon as those reforms are identified and finalized, we'll make that public. But we are also doing quite a lot of work that has been announced in this medium-term budget policy statement as the National Treasury on how to strengthen a local government. I'll give one example which relates to the various support mechanisms for local government in the National Treasury, the mechanisms that we use to deploy technical experts to assist local government municipalities that are having a challenge. And one of the things we are doing is our various local government initiatives are being combined into a single mechanism so that we can better deploy skills into municipalities and better target those municipalities, especially those that we assist with the implementation of financial recovery plans. So there are a set of initiatives that are happening internal in terms of the Treasury, including, for example, reforming local government, local conditional grants. And then there are a set of initiatives that will be announced in partnership with the presidency as part of Operation Vulindlela that we'll be announcing shortly.
So, I mean, I think I understand all of that, and I want this to work. But I mean, Mogale City, I think it was, received a huge amount of money from the National Water Department, and still they're pumping raw sewage into the Vaal River. eThekwini's had national interventions, nothing's changed. Councils aren't paying what they're supposed to pay. The minister made this point about water boards yesterday. What I'm trying to get to is, and I understand that you're in an impossible position, and it's not your fault that this has happened. And I don't think it's the fault of the National Treasury that you may not be able to do much in local government, or that Vulindlela can't do much in local government. But it's actually a political problem. It is the mayor of places like Lekwe who've decided not to do anything that really lead to this. And I don't know if national government can do anything about that.
Yeah, I think our minister has been quite clear, certainly in his public statements, that a lot of the challenges in local government are in fact political. And he has had first-hand experience of that because of the various municipalities that he has had to get directly involved in. What we have tried to do from our perspective is to see how can we use the tools at our disposal to strengthen local government. And that's really about financial management, the interventions that we have, for example, and that we are considering now in those municipalities that have not been paying water boards, that could compromise the future viability of those water boards, as well as the review of the broader conditional grant system, and so on. But I think you're right. I think ultimately a lot of these challenges are political, and what we can do is work within our mandate to see what support can be given, and ultimately, in some cases, political and other interventions will be required.
Dr. Duncan Pieterse, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. I found that very illuminating, actually, and for me at least, some clarity coming through about some of what was announced yesterday and what the future plans are for spending patterns in government.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Grant Nader is Portfolio Manager at the Benguela Global Fund Managers. Grant, good evening to you. Not very often we start with beer in this segment, but AB InBev shares down dramatically on the day because beer volumes or beer is not being sold, and I presume drunk, or not enough of it, in China, the US, and Mexico.
Good evening, Stephen. I mean, this is not a new thing, and if you zoom out and you look at global trends towards the youngsters are moving away from alcohol, full stop. They're moving to some sort of mixers, and they're also moving to cleaner living. So this is not a new phenomenon. I think this is on top of that, they've had a lot of own goals, as we know, and they've made things hard for themselves. So I feel like this is a difficult space in general right now, and I don't know how this trend changes. We're seeing it with some of the hard liquor as well. Some of the Remy Cointreau and Pernod, these kind of brands as well. So it's a difficult situation. I mean, yes, there's still that inelastic demand factor, especially with the older generation. But I'm not sure that the new sort of generation is tuned into this kind of lifestyle.
I mean, so the year of peak alcohol in places like the UK, I think, was just after the year 2000. So there is a very real shift happening, and there's going to be financial shifts as a result of that. The other big story today, of course, the platinum price down significantly, and platinum shares after those tremendous rallies last week. That correction sort of continues.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite incredible. But, the platinum shares have had a proper sell-off, but they are all still up between about 8 and 15% for the month. Can you believe that? But the platinum price is actually back to the levels it was before that massive rally that it had. So it does bode, to me it says there's possibly still more to come in this. And of course this was all driven by that rumor around the sanctions on Russian palladium supply. But if you have a quick look at what happened when Russia invaded the Ukraine and they sanctioned their oil spiked materially, but within 6 months it was back to the level the day before the invasion. So one has to be careful about putting long-term projections based on these short-term measures.
And then, obviously, US stocks, the run-up to the election, they're a bit muted at the moment. That's largely because of sort of costs associated with AI, according to Microsoft and Meta. But just to try and even imagine what the American stock market is going to look like next week, hard to predict.
Yeah, it is hard, and there's different policy in the different camps. And people are behaving like it's life and death out there in the US. They're very partisan at the moment. But, what history has shown is that the issue that markets have is uncertainty. One way or the other, when this election has played out, within a couple of months, it will be old news and the markets will be back to the market. Other than, obviously, events like tariffs maybe and things like that. So it is causing noise, but I think this kind of volatility tends to prove it to be an opportunity long term.
Grant Nader, thanks very much indeed, Portfolio Manager at Benguela Global Fund Managers.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702
1702.
Well, already responses coming through to the conversations you've been listening to on the program. You heard, of course, the National Treasury Director General just a few moments ago.
How's it, Stephen? This person you've got on from Treasury having a conversation with you, I must say I'm extremely impressed. He is extremely eloquent. You put a couple of touchy questions to him, and unlike all the other politicians, he's dealt with them, and I thought he dealt with them very well and without going around the bush. I wish we had 1,000 more of him. We'd be in a different world, wouldn't we? But anyway, I just thought I'd say great speaker, very eloquent, crystal clear, and no ducking and diving like the others.
Well,
good chat. Thanks. Bye. It's Adrian.
Adrian, thanks for that. Not often that senior bureaucrats, particularly those in the National Treasury, get some love. Just a thought, though, and this is not about Duncan Pieterse at all, but just a sort of arbitrary thought that entered my brain, which is with the coalition situation that we have at the moment. I do wonder sometimes if one day we'll actually have an apolitical finance minister. And of course, everyone will remember Derek Keyes, and I think it was Chris Liebenberg in the 1990s. But I do wonder if that might actually happen again, just because it's the only way to kind of manage a coalition. Anyway, let's see. Your thoughts, 011-883-0702, 021-446-0567.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
7:45 the time. Good evening. Well, one of the standout news stories of the year so far has been, I suppose, I must use this phrase, the new gold rush. The price of gold rising sometimes almost coming close to $2,800 on international markets. You've heard commentary before about why this is. It's related to gold's safe haven status. We've been told there's fresh demand for gold in India because of a change in regulations there. From what I understand, central banks went through a phase of buying more gold as well. Well, a new report from the World Gold Council saying total gold demand has increased by 5% year on year. Krish Gopaul is the Senior Analyst for Europe, the Middle East and Africa at the World Gold Council. Chris, good evening to you. Thank you for your time. 5%, that's very significant. Why is demand for gold up so strongly?
Absolutely, yeah. 5% up in the third quarter is very notable. And we also note in the report that actually gold demand in Q3 actually hit a record high of $100 billion US, which is the first time that we've seen that. And I think, we can point to a few areas of the gold market where we saw strength. So we saw investment demand actually perform fairly well, particularly in gold ETFs, but also on the over-the-counter or OTC market. And that was predominantly driven by high net worth individuals and institutional investors. And I think the drivers behind a lot of that interest that we've seen recently is just the geopolitical and economic environment that we're in. There's a heightened degree of uncertainty at the moment. Next week we have the US election, and that's a pivotal moment and what that may mean. And we're also seeing, as you rightly say, still robust central bank demand in the third quarter and this year as a whole. So overall, I think the picture at the gold market at the moment, particularly in Q3, was one of general strength.
Central banks buying gold for the same reason, geopolitical risk?
Yeah, we speak to central banks, and certainly the uncertainty that are affecting investors is certainly something that holds true for central banks as well. Gold's role traditionally as a kind of an inflation hedge or a store of value, its performance in times of crisis, its ability to act as a diversifier, they're all really important reasons why central banks hold gold. And if you look at the environment we've been in for some time now, that's very much at the forefront. So you can see why central banks are still very positive on gold and still continue to accumulate even to this day.
Is it just that, the increased risk? What I'm trying to get to, has anything structurally changed in the gold market that even if some of that risk reduced, if there was peace in Ukraine, the Middle East, a very clear direction of travel in the United States, for example, if all of that happened, would we still have a very elevated gold price? Has anything structurally changed, or is this just one of those moments for gold?
I certainly think there has been structural changes over the long term. So central banks have been buyers, for example, for quite some time. Their positions and their increases have been much more strategic in nature. They tend to be less price sensitive too. What we've seen more recently on the investment side, though, is certainly when it comes to ETFs, is that seems to be a lot more a recent phenomenon. If we look at the year as a whole, while we did see inflows into those products earlier in the year from Asian investors in particular, we really saw an absence of interest in gold ETFs from Western investors. Now, as we move forward into the second and third quarter, we've slowly seen those Western investors return. Some of that is to the reasons we've already mentioned, the heightened geopolitical and economic uncertainty, but Some of it also is the fear of missing out, the idea that actually as the gold price rally has continued, investors have come back into gold looking to kind of get on the bandwagon and trying to gain some of that momentum that gold has got so far this year. But structurally, I think certainly the standout really is the central bank piece, and that's been a long-standing. The investment story, while has been generally positive, has been overly positive more recently.
I mean, there's no ceiling to this, is there? If the US sees a contested election outcome or, a very difficult situation, the war in Ukraine intensifies, gets worse, the Middle East situation gets even worse, tensions between the US and China escalate. I mean, all sorts of scenarios, obviously all of them very cheerful, but all sorts of scenarios that could see gold price, I presume, going much higher than it is now.
Well, we don't forecast the gold price here at the World Gold Council, but we certainly look at the drivers and the backdrop and the economic environment that we're in. And everything you say is fair. I mean, there are a huge amount of uncertainties. And I mentioned the US election next week. There's no guarantee that necessarily whoever wins, that the uncertainty is necessarily going to be dialed down. Certainly as we move into 2025, there's still a lot of question marks, as you rightly say, the geopolitical backdrop that we've got, not just in the US, but in the Middle East, unfortunately, in Asia as well. There are a number of hotspots that we've got. And again, big question marks on how those might be resolved and how long that might take. And on the economic front too, general weakness and question marks over different economies and what that might mean for central bank policy towards that. Again, huge question mark. So generally gold tends to perform well when we have heightened uncertainty, and we've seen that this year. Obviously, we have to wait and see what the events of the rest of the year and in 2025 bring. But certainly, in terms of the end of the year for gold demand, we tend to be quite positive, at least on the investment and the central bank side. Obviously, the corollary to that is higher prices mean weaker gold jewelry. But overall, I think things are looking as it stands, optimistic for gold.
I mean, gold's still unique. We've had commentary about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies from other people on this program in the last few months. This is not my view, this is theirs, suggesting that this could become, that Bitcoin could become a sort of safe haven and almost challenge gold. But clearly that's not happening from the gold price at the moment.
Yeah, I think what we've seen clearly is this year gold is kind of showcasing why it's been around for so long, and it's regarded as the ultimate kind of inflation hedge and kind of safe haven. That's not to say that that's its only strengths. It does perform well even in good times as well as bad. But certainly, I think, gold is really shining this year. And while we have seen those comparisons as well, generally we regard gold and Bitcoin as very different assets with very different characteristics. And again, of course, investors might be attracted to one or the other or both. But we feel that the gold brings something unique to a portfolio.
Krish, thank you very much indeed. Krish Gopaul is the Senior Analyst for Europe, the Middle East and Africa at the World Gold Council. It's fascinating to just watch the price of gold. And of course, the impact it has on our economy. 8 minutes to 7.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, pioneering cash management solutions for our clients, as honored by Euromoney Cash Management Survey 2024.
5 minutes to 7 the time. Well, you may remember a couple of weeks ago, the online retailer Jumia saying that it was closing its South African operation. You would have known it as Zando. Take-A-Lot selling its fashion retailer Superbalist. We've had a lot of talk, of course, on this program about Shein and Temu. Is it just that? Siphumelele Zondi is our tech expert. He joins us at this time on a Friday. Siphumelele, good evening. These retailers, I mean, they seem to be closing up shops. Sometimes they're selling their operations. I mean, what's the real aim here? They're obviously under intense pressure.
Well, yes. Hello, Stephen. The thing is, online retail is growing significantly in South Africa. 2023, MasterCard said about 6% of sales in South Africa were done online, predicted to be about 10% in the year 2025. That's just next year. But these retailers you need to remember that they're selling clothes. And yes, there has been a problem that's come with fast fashion that's largely coming from China, because over there they're selling clothes at a much cheaper price. And so South Africans are buying clothes the most online, more than any other product. But at the same time, there's been this interruption that's come in the last year, especially this year, that's come from China, which has been hurting local clothing sellers and the industry in general.
I mean, Amazon's just arrived in South Africa, and I presume they're selling clothes too.
Amazon sells just about anything really online. So people who are selling just about anything are largely going to do well, because you're realizing that there are also other big brands that are selling stuff online, technology, furniture, whatever it may be. So a platform like Amazon, which has been doing really, really well overseas, especially in the United States of America for quite a very long time, selling just about anything. You can, if you're looking for a book, if you're looking for a piece of technology, you find it on Amazon. And I think they want to check the South African market and whether they can thrive here as well, as they've thrived in other markets, especially in the United States.
So, I mean, obviously, with Shein and Temu, I mean, what are we buying online? We're buying a lot of clothes. I would presume we're still buying electronics too.
Oh, we're buying a lot of stuff, because what you're also going to realize is that a lot of brick and mortar retailers in South Africa also now, a lot of them started with takeaways, and then it was food, which people are also buying online. But now they're going into big stuff like your furniture pieces. For example, a big one which became big during COVID, 6060, they started with the scooters that were delivering food. They've now invested in trucks that will be delivering technology and pieces of furniture as well to people's homes, which means they're now realizing that people are interested and they are buying other things at home as well, and they want to get into that as well, as people were going into the shops to look for these products at the brick and mortar retailer, and now they want to then have them available online and deliver them to people's doorsteps.
You still see shopping malls everywhere. I mean, some of them aren't doing very well. Think Fourways. Fourways Mall's not doing very well, it seems. But you still see shopping malls everywhere, and we still see some places shopping malls going up. I mean, they must be competing some way.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I think it's going to be hybrid for a very long time in South Africa, because we keep on talking about this digital divide that South Africa has. I think there's a new shopping mall in the northern rural parts of KZN that opened just today, the Princess Mkabayi Mall, it's called. So, yes, shopping malls in South Africa in certain parts of the country are going to continue to do well, because South Africa is quite segmented, as you know, Stephen, in terms of the clientele in South Africa. But there's also growth, especially in the more affluent areas, of people who are buying stuff. People who are buying stuff online. It's 71 billion of the money that was made online last year. That's set to grow to about 75 billion next year of the money that's made online. So yes, but it's going to be more hybrid, catering to different needs of the South African consumer and the different kinds of South African consumers as well.
Siphumelele, thanks very much indeed. Siphumelele Zondi, tech expert. We hear from him every week at this time. More to come. We'll talk about agricultural research in just a moment. I mean, there's a huge issue around that, and the fact that it seems that we're just not spending enough money. And then managing volatility, your investment school this evening. How to manage the volatility of the South African market. Good evening. You're with The Money Show, 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
6 minutes after 7, good evening. The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, recognized by Euromoney Cash Management Survey 2024 for pioneering cash management solutions for their clients. Welcome to the second hour of the program. Plenty to come. We'll talk about managing volatility with investments, and I suppose you could say the same of the US and many other places, but sometimes our stock market does give the impression of large amounts of volatility. How do you manage that? And of course, it always becomes about managing the long game, doesn't it? How you plan over the longer term. Looking forward to that from 7:30 this evening. We will be talking about running businesses in township areas and particularly building a brand in the next few moments, and then more on agriculture in just a moment. Good to hear from you as well on 011 883 0702 021 4460 567. I was particularly struck in some ways by the conversation we had about an hour ago with Dr. Duncan Pieterse, the Director General in the National Treasury, about Operation Vulindlela and what's going to happen in local government. And this is one of the fundamental questions, is that, and it's a one in a way that I think we're going to be wrestling with for a while. How do you manage the money in local government if the politics creates situations where people can't manage it themselves, or whether there are all sorts of problems? And I'm reminded that there was some research done, I think, by the South African Local Government Association, that around 2/3 of councillors at the most had a matric qualification. They had nothing other than that. Now, you can't blame councillors in that position. Look at our history, look at our lived reality right now. But it does mean that when you want to manage, for example, the budget statement or the financial statement of Joburg or Kuruleni or Cape Town, that there might be some problems. At the same time, though, you couldn't, and certainly in my view, you could never say to someone you can't be a councillor because you're not educated enough. I think that would just be wrong. There are all sorts of questions that flow from it that get to the heart of the management of these problems. And I think that Duncan Pieterse was quite correct in suggesting and sort of admitting that many of these were political problems. He was quoting the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana when he said that. But they are political problems that lead directly to potholes.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
Well, some criticism this week from two well-known experts in the agricultural field about the amount of money government is spending, or I suppose not spending, on agricultural research. Professor Johan Kirsten and Wandile Seklobo suggesting we're only spending around 1% of our agricultural budget on agricultural research. Johan Kirsten is the Professor of Agricultural Economics at the University of Stellenbosch and also Director at the Bureau for Economic Research. Johan, good evening, and thank you so much for your time on The Money Show. You say we're spending too little on agricultural research. How much money should we be spending? Obviously a lot more.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So what we basically ask, are we spending sufficiently on agricultural research? And just to correct the figure, it's a bit complicated because we have different sources of funding for research and different executors of research. But maybe just to put the picture for everybody is that research is so critical because innovation and development of new things and is very important for productivity growth, very important for economic growth. So if you just look at the US, why it's doing so well in its economy, the whole US spent about 3.5% of its total GDP on all kinds of research, and therefore is a leading economy. And therefore, if you want to grow and if you want to improve your productivity, research is a critical dimension of that. So the questions that we're asking is, how much do we spend? By whom? Who pays for it? On what do we spend it? Is it enough? And what is the impact? Now, just to put the picture in South Africa in play, is that the agricultural budget recognizes that they spend annually around $1 billion. Some years it's below $1 billion, other years above $1 billion. That is transferred to the Agricultural Research Council. That is roughly about 10% of the agricultural budget. But if you then start looking at other sources of funding from the commodity organizations and from universities and from the private sector, the extent of that spend on research is quite substantive. But if you then translate it to a share of the agricultural value produced in the country, it's not even 1%. So that is where the 1% figure more or less comes from.
I mean, you compare that to the US spending 3% of GDP. I mean, the difference is vast.
Yes.
If we spend more money on agricultural research, what would we spend it on? And that's a complicated way of asking you, what are the sort of hot areas of agricultural research right now?
Yeah. Now, obviously, if you look at the problems agriculture is facing, it's issues related to climate change, weather shocks, its adaptability to climate change. So it is genetic improvements to adapt your plants and varieties to that. Then obviously big issues, diseases. And you've probably been reporting a lot on animal diseases. So doing research and spending enough research on the way to combat these diseases and find the correct vaccines and develop the correct vaccines is all elements that would be critical. And then obviously if you want to export, and given that agriculture is a major export industry, you need to find mechanisms to ensure that your losses in the journey to the export market is limited. So therefore there's all sorts of research in the logistics field as well. But then fundamentally, if you want to be profitable in agriculture, your productivity of your trees, of your plants, of your animals are critical. And therefore, genetic improvements, the feed conversion, fertilizer conversion, water conversion is all elements that one would focus on.
I mean, if, for example, we were able to prevent in citrus, I think it's called black spot, that would stop the Spanish from putting pressure on the EU to stop our exports to Europe.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that's quite an interesting story about citrus, because the point we're making in the little article is that citrus has been very progressive in the way that they spend on research. Now, they spend probably close to 0.5% of the total value of citrus production on research, with a total budget of 156 million that is generated from levy income from the producers. And in that way, they've been able to make the case through research for the EU to say, but you can't prevent us from exporting to you because there are certain facts that you don't have on the table. We have it on the table because we've executed the research.
Just because we're not spending money on research doesn't mean other people aren't. You gave the example of the US. I'm presuming that means that breakthroughs that could happen here will happen in other places.
Yes, and that's a very important factor as well, given the globalized world we live in, is that we import a lot of technology, especially in the mechanical technology, planting equipment, tractors, seed improvements developed by large private and multinational companies. So obviously, a part of the productivity gains we get in agriculture comes from imported technology that with private research and often sometimes international funded research that also benefits our farmers.
Okay, so we're not spending enough money. Is there just no appetite for it? Is the money being spent productively somewhere else, maybe on certain costs that have to be borne, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, there could be, but I think a golden rule is that you need to at least spend around 1% or 2% of your agricultural GDP on research to account for to ensure that you have productivity growth over time. And often research programs, you can have money in the program, but if the research programs are not effectively designed and not well managed, that could also lead to wastage. So I think it's not only the money that you spend, but it's how you spend it, and you can actually allocate your resources much better if your programs are focused and designed on the specific needs of the industry. But getting to the needs of the industry is quite difficult because there's always a lot of stakeholders around the table that have alternative views, and that becomes quite critical to do.
I mean, it's a classic political problem, isn't it? Politics is often short-termist because the politician needs the results now, in a coalition era perhaps more than ever. And when you spend money on agricultural research, you're looking at something that'll, I'm sorry to use this phrase, bear fruit 10 years down the line.
Exactly, and that's a very important point that I wanted to raise in the beginning, is that research, as you say, bear fruit only in a long term. So often the results is either a 10 or a 25 year down the line. But if you don't invest in an improved fruit tree now, you will never see the results. So varietal improvements in long-term crops is a very important example of how the funding of the research don't provide a return for the politician to brag about in the term of office. And that is the biggest reason why we need to make the case for research all across the disciplines, because otherwise we will just go backward.
I mean, particularly you mentioned climate change, and we're in Southern Africa going to be hit by it very hard. In fact, we probably are already if you look at some of the temperatures in Gauteng recently. There are obviously limits to what research can do. But the fact is we're going to pay a very high price for not doing it if you look at how the weather is changing. That's
right. So there's obviously genetic improvements that can help, for example, for drought-tolerant crops. There could be research in terms of how animals can deal with heat stress. But obviously, when you have a shock, a massive flood, comprehensive drought, there's not much you can do. But then research should be done in terms of how you mitigate the losses, and that could be insurance products. It could be subsidized programs that could help. So this could also be an economic and insurance and a market research that could mitigate the damage that's caused by big climate events. But over time, as climate changes, we need to adapt, and therefore some improvements in genetics is always the way to go.
Professor Johan Kirsten, really appreciate the time tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Professor of Agricultural Economics at the University of Stellenbosch, Director of the Bureau for Economic Research there as well. We've been quoting them quite extensively of late. It's fascinating to look at where the money would go and farming sort of the future, how that's going to work. And I don't know if you have any vision or any thoughts or any ideas of what farming could look like in the next 30 to 40 years. But if you go back 30 or 40 years. If you go back, say, to the 1980s, on some levels, farming hasn't changed very much. But on other levels, it's changed almost fundamentally. I mean, just look at weather prediction, for example. Look at, the increased efficiency of when to plant, when not to plant, things like that. All of that's the result of some form of research somewhere, someone trying something somewhere. And as a result of that, food prices come down, and we forget that, in the 1940s in North America, for example, food was roughly half the expenses of a family. It's now around 8%, I think, in the US. And of course, here it's a very different picture. But the point is that that food prices around the world have reduced dramatically because of the changes in the way that we farm. And I think there's still scope to continue doing that if we spend enough money on research.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
This is Now Small Business Focus. It's brought to you by Capitec. No matter the size of your business, Capitec's got you. Focusing this evening on how you build brands in township businesses. Bulelani Balabala is the founder of the Township Entrepreneurs Alliance. He's in our studio now. He's wearing a cap, by the way, that says, "Get things done." Bulelani, that probably describes you and most other entrepreneurs I know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think if you're an entrepreneur, the very ethos of being an entrepreneur is productivity, consistently on the move.
Get things done.
Yeah.
So, okay, we're talking about building a brand as an entrepreneur in a township, and much of it will be the same. Maybe the way in which you communicate, that you get involved in the community. How do you go about doing that, building a brand?
So I think first and foremost, there's a number of things that we need to get out the way. The first and foremost is, and it's quite an interesting one, right? I mean, the first 4 pillars, right, that go into building a brand really is, I think every one of us have this, whether it's in a profile or a proposal document or our websites, but we rarely never delve deep into it, right? The first one is vision, which is a one-liner, that philosophical one-liner that talks about all the whimsical things that you are about and you want to achieve. The second one is objectives, which is ordinarily most of the time mixed with missions, right? These are all the milestones that you'd like to achieve with timelines and goals. The third one is values. Now, the interesting thing about the values is, you almost, you walk into different spaces, and I always say to entrepreneurs, who in here has integrity as one of their values? And quite interestingly enough, almost every business has got integrity as one of their values. But the very interesting thing about that is, because of the fact that we have not made it measurable, it means that you have left it to interpretation in and amongst your staff members. So which is why, in the pursuit of building a brand, it's important for you to make things like values measurable. And I'll tell you why. Because if you are able to make a value statement like integrity and then put a one-liner that defines it and says that integrity to us as a business means doing what we said we would do, and then put 3 or 4 action line items that says to measure integrity in the business, it means that you would have demonstrated that you understand your clear briefs from your supervisors or clients. Number 3, you are able to clearly articulate and deliver on this because a supervisor signed up on it. And then number 3, over and above that, is you've gotten buy-in from the team that says that you have delivered over and above what was required from you. The moment you are able to put that in place, it develops the fourth thing, that intangible thing that's called culture. When you walk into this beautiful Studio 702, no one can put their finger on it, but there's that one intrinsic, consistent thing everyone says about this place when they come here. That is consistently derived from values, because the moment you align and stream your values in the right way, they breed culture. Culture breeds habits. Habits then lead into that intangible thing that people, intangible thing that people always know you for. So What does that mean for being a business owner that wants to build a deliberate brand? It's not just about how you do it, it's also then about how you show up and how you do it matters. So equally so, it's about playing the long game. So ordinarily what we have then done is that we are competing for short-term things or short-gain things. So in our relationship with our customers and our clients, we are looking for quick wins. But, quick wins are very finite in thinking. So if you want to build your business in the long term, you play the long game. And I think, when I look back at my over 20-year entrepreneurship journey, because I started very young, I think I was 16 at the time when I formally started my first business and I got it registered, and I've been employed ever since. It was playing the long game. There were low-hanging fruits and low-hanging carrots in the society and in the market. But when you picked that particular carrot or that apple, it was only going to lead to damnation in the long run. So sometimes as business owners, I think the biggest challenge as well is the conversation around how you start. Because start should only be limited to resources, but never to mindset. But what we do as small business owners is that we start with a small mindset because we look at the resources that we are and then we call it humility.
Sure. How important is that issue of mindset? I mean, you're going into this and this is it can be explained in other ways, the horizon, in other words, how big you see. Can you just do the suburb? Could you actually service everyone in this township? Could you actually service everyone in Gauteng? But mindset is key to all of this. You've got to have some kind of sense of what you're doing.
No. You definitely need to. You know what? We spend money on different things, whether food, whether friends, whether loved ones, whether husbands and wives, whether hair, whether certain things, right, that we like. But, when you sort of sit and you ask people, how much money do you redirect towards personal development? You get a quizzical look. How much time do you redirect to that, right? And then when you sort of break it down to say that, when you move around in spaces, whether work, whether social spaces, or whether mall infrastructures, you've got Wi-Fi, internet, where you could go onto social media platforms. And if you're deliberate enough, you could go onto your notes on your phone and write all the things that you need to learn about that would make you a better professional in whatever sector and space that you're in, all the things that you're curious about. And then on the other side, whether it's romantic or you're a dad like me, I've got two boys that live with me. I've got a note of things that I've pre-downloaded on my digital platforms to watch whether I'm on or offline. And that's my deliberate move in developing me. Why? Because if I don't, at the end of the day, the reality of it is, if you are not consistently disrupting yourself as small business owners, someone else is going to disrupt you in the game, because the only way to consistently develop a competitive advantage is to be agile. Now, what we then ordinarily do as small business owners is that we derelict, we delegate and we derelict. And you're not supposed to delegate and derelict, because it's our fiduciary responsibility to have our hands on the pulse of our businesses. What does that mean? That means that as a business owner, it doesn't matter how many number of staff members you have in your business at any moment of time, you then need to consistently know the numbers of your business. And the only way to be opened up to understand that kind of stuff is to consistently develop, to shape and shift your mindset.
You also need some systems and processes. You need to actually have something in place that makes all of this happen.
No, true. Think about it this way. Anyone, I picked this up as a big shocker when I went into business, but the passion that drives us into business will only make up 1% of what we actually do, in the activities that we run or do in our businesses at the end of the day. Think about it this way, you go into there and you're working somewhere where they told you we're the best mechanic. Why don't you start your own thing, man? You are so good. This company is held by you. You start your own thing. Now you realize you're an accountant. You're a cleaner. You're the guy who needs to run invoices. You're the person who must pitch and a myriad of all these other things. So at the very crux of it, there's a number of things that then become very important. It's understanding the three principles, right? Number one, it's understanding that as an individual who goes into business, you're always playing three roles. The first one is the technical mode. The second one is the managerial mode. The third one is the entrepreneurial mode. So the entrepreneurial mode is that whimsical inspiration that says, because I'm a great mechanic, I'm going to go do this thing. Then you get stuck in the technical mode where you always have your head buried in the deliverables for your clients. So being aware of this then helps you in being able to develop the right type of systems. But this, every time we talk about systems and processes, it seems like a big conversation, big conversation of big name buzzwords that need consultants. No, think about it in a simple term. term. Jot down every single thing you do between Monday, over a 7-day or 2-week period. Every single thing from the moment you wake up to the moment you sleep. At the end of that week or whatever duration you seek to choose, start to then rule out anything that could be done by someone else falls under technical mode. Anything that was supervisory work where you were supervising over third-party contractors that you subcontracted falls under that. And anything that was entrepreneurial, what is entrepreneurial? The simplest term is anytime you are client-facing and selling or ideating new projects or ideating where you want to be in the next 4 or 5 years. The moment you've then listed out all the technical things that could be done by someone else, put simple steps behind it. Because some of the things that are blockages in our businesses, I'm the only one who can do it. No one can do it like me. I'm the expert and I'm the best at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is the limiting capabilities and capacity that we then bring in. So the only way to break out of that is to understand that you could actually break it down into steps. And the moment you break it down into steps, it's measurable. When it's measurable, you can delegate it to someone else. And then you can play the supervisory role. Now, what that then does, it puts you in an amazing position where you're able to do more entrepreneurial stuff and more managerial stuff. But the biggest commitment every single business owner needs to focus on, and this is normally seen in your financial statements or your management accounts, is decide on your time and your flow in your business. But my advice to you is spend an hour every single day of the week doing 2 things. The first 30 minutes of the hour, you're following up on old clients that you've sent quotes to. The second hour, which is the 30 minutes, you are finding new individuals to talk to. Because what we get caught up in, because we don't have the right systems in place, and that's why I said our financials tell the story, is when you get customers, you've got your hand buried in the ground, in that particular moment, there are no sales coming in, right? It's because you're delivering for clients. The moment you pick your head up, there are no customers, and then you lose a month looking for customers and you don't have money. You get the customers in on the 3rd month, you jump up. So your financials are consistently going up and down. And these are some of the things that then affect us when we're sort of looking for funding from DFIs or funding or banking institutions. Not that they don't want to give us the money. We are not playing the game in the right manner.
Bulelani, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
I enjoyed this.
We enjoyed having you. You got it done. Bulelani Balabala is the founder of the Township Entrepreneurs Alliance. Just gone 7:30.
The Money Show on 702.
Monday to Friday, 6 to 8 p.m.
Why settle for slow when you can get paid just like that? Capitec's new Print and Pro card machines process payments faster with free next-day settlements 24/7. Get a Pro for just 499 Rand or a Print for 999 Rand. Order online for free delivery in 3 to 5 days, no contract. Don't miss out. Offer valid till the 30th of November. Capitec's got you no matter your business size. Visit capitecbank.co.za/business or a branch.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Well, tonight we're looking at how you navigate market volatility and particularly strategies for long-term growth. And if you look, for example, at our markets, how they've changed almost completely. The direction of travel has changed so dramatically since the election in ways that very few people actually predicted. It really does become about how you manage that kind of volatility. Krish Gopaul is the Chief Investment Officer and Principal at First Avenue Investment Management. Asanda Norche is the Chief Investment Officer at Mazi Asset Management. Gents, thanks so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. Asanda, let me just start with you if I can. So we have a volatile market, and it's particularly at the moment, I'm thinking of the US elections, I'm thinking of geopolitics, it's a volatile time. I mean, it'd be tempting for some people to just leave the market and buy gold, and we discussed that earlier on the program. What's the first rule when the times are so volatile, markets are so volatile? How do you approach it?
Well, evening. Thanks, Stephen, and good evening to the listeners. I suppose throwing in the towel is an option, but we won't do that. I think having your objective clear in your mind in terms of what you're trying to do is always helpful, because it's tempting in these moments to, let's say things don't go your way. You made that call and you thought this particular company is going to go up and it hasn't. But maintaining that understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve, one, from an objective perspective, means you understand your time horizon. And understanding your time horizon then also makes it clear how much risk you're able to take over how long. And I think the concept of risk is often misunderstood. So taking risk doesn't mean... And sort of having diversification and so on doesn't mean you won't be exposed to risk. There is a possibility. But when you spend time in the market and really have the patience, you then have the possibility of recovering some of the losses and seeing some of that growth in the longer term.
Hlelo, I mean, again, so often with investing, it becomes about the longer term focus.
Right. And I also wanted to just add that not all risks are equal. one's definition of risk depends on who your clients are. The average member of a pension fund is almost a risk-neutral person. In other words, they cannot tolerate long periods of being on the wrong side of a phenomenon, of an economic phenomenon. However, a high net worth individual might have a greater accommodation for avoiding certain risks, right? If a high net worth person really wants growth, there are certain periods of time that he's willing to pay away through losses in order to make gains in the long term. But on average, if we're talking about the average person, what we want to do is to distill risks into 3 or 4 buckets and attach probabilities to them and arrange a portfolio such that it addresses the possibility that one of those probabilities could show up. If you were to just choose one of them yourself and put your portfolio and arrange a portfolio to be aligned with just one risk, to address that one risk, well, what if you're wrong? Because that possibility or probability is 25%, has a 25% chance of occurring. What about the other 75%? So oftentimes in a portfolio, you have holdings or securities or investments that almost contradict each other. And someone looks at it and says, well, why would you hold OUTsurance as a really great quality company and gold at the same time? Well, because I want long-term growth with OUTsurance, and I might want great dividend yields with British American Tobacco, but if the world goes to hell in a handbasket, I want some gold. And any one of those options can show up. So you have to have a portfolio that addresses some of the big moving parts in an economy as people talk about it.
And some of it takes us to the question around diversification. You need to really make sure that you actually do have a diverse portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I guess the, eggs in one basket analogy comes to mind. But again, what is the purpose of diversification? And to come back to what Lo was saying, it really is about exposing yourself to asset classes or assets that have got different characteristics, such that you've got the opportunity to overall reduce the amount of risk that you're exposed to, because these things are acting in different ways at different times. But at the same time, having the opportunity to, whilst reducing the risk, still gain from the potential, let's say, returns that they're likely to generate. I think what's also important is, diversification, maybe to my earlier point, doesn't mean that there's no risk. There's always risk in whatever you're doing as you take risk, let's say in the stock market and so on. But the act of diversifying is reducing the possibility of adverse outcomes sort of acting upon you in a really major way. So it's not to say there's no risk. You might experience risk, but it's just really managing that risk. So there might be that really, really great idea that you think I need to be in, boots and all. But you need to then consider the level of exposure you have to that particular risk. And then we come to then the diversification question.
And I suppose, Clelo, it also, there's a sort of question around high risk and high return. So you talk about risk, you have to take some risk somewhere.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what's the point? You might as well just buy gold.
Yes. That statement, high risk, high return, is an oxymoron. It does not exist. The greater the risk you take, the lower the probability of a return.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a certain point in that continuum of risk where you maximize the potential return that's associated with any investment. The idea or the trick over time with experience is you have to know what that point is, right? Beyond that point is speculation. And I think it's a disservice to clients, whoever has given you assets or money, it's a disservice to them not to know that point. But that comes with experience. And this is a really good definition of risk. I think the foundational definition of risk is impairment of capital. So not just falling behind the market, which is an opportunity cost. It's not a risk, it's just an opportunity cost. It's losing someone's capital, right? The very capital they gave you $100. In 3 years' time, it's now $40. And then in 10 years' time, it's $20 with no chance of recovery because you invested in companies that are are going bankrupt, right? And you'd be surprised at the number of companies that go bankrupt in say a generation, in a 30-year span. Yeah. You'd be surprised at the number. The number is staggering. Survivorship bias, or the survival rate, is extremely low. Now, not as low as venture capital or private equity, but low enough that you need to really be aware of the cutoff line between risk and speculation, investing and speculation.
Asanda, I suppose the other thing is that, and Clelo almost touched on, is around time in the market, right? I mean, you need to know what your time horizon is, and that's kind of everything.
Absolutely. I think especially when you're taking risk and you are exposing yourself to assets that have got that risk and are of a higher risk nature, you can't expect that things happen in your time horizon, especially at shorter time horizon, because that's the very nature of the assets, is that there's many moving parts. We mentioned earlier there's a lot of volatility at the moment. Macro trends, you've got the war in the Middle East, or conflict in Russia, Ukraine. You've got what's happening with the US election. We've got our own GNU, for that matter. So in the midst of all of that, if you then say, look, I'm going to be in today, out in 3 months' time, who knows what's going to happen? And so you do need to give these things and give these assets time to really deliver. And if you granulate it and make it, give an example. If you look at a company like ShopRite as an example, so you might say, look, I'm going to be, maybe do a quick trade, but perhaps you miss the trend of the work that the management team of ShopRite does in terms of understanding retailing better, doing more in terms of their systems, gaining market share in the market. So that takes some time. Now, in and out doesn't really give you the opportunity to experience that actual granular movement in things. And actually, at an economy level, you could characterize it as GDP growth. GDP growth doesn't happen in months. It compounds. It's over time. And if you think about companies, they are selling goods, selling services, and that all compounds or is sort of summed up in GDP growth, which doesn't happen in the matter of weeks and months.
So, Lelo, you're investing in this way. You've really got to have a time span of 5 years and more. Would that be the lowest? It's got to be at some point. You've just got to say, this is money I'm not going to touch for this period of time. And I imagine, we're talking years at least.
Yeah. I have to say that, Sandra and I in the institutional market, there's something ironic that confronts us, right? That compounding is really valuable in the outer years. And the outer years is 20 years plus, right? Just look at Clicks today, right? Clicks has 25% of the pharmacy market, right? In 2000, and this is 24 years later, in 2000, Clicks were struggling to set foot in the pharmacy market. They even went to Australia to look for growth, and they came back with, their tail, between their legs. They went from 1% market share to 24% market share in a space of 24 years. So that's 1% per year. By all accounts, that's blistering. Okay. Now let's just say that you thought about that, and you were holding Clicks, you're holding a ShopRite. Similar position, the ShopRite example that he gave. Pick and Pay used to be the gold standard in the industry in the 90s. In 2000, ShopRite started to make the moves it's now very mature at. So a few of these companies. In the meantime, though, decision makers, fund allocators, pension fund trustees, and so on, multi-managers, they don't have 25 years in which they're reviewing you. They're reviewing you really quarterly, but they can make decisions every 3 years to remove you when you've taken a long-term view. So investing is a long-term view, but the decision-making around it, in terms of you being able to execute, doesn't have that much grace of a period, And then, what does that do? It makes investors to take even shorter investment decisions, shorter horizon investment decisions. It makes us look for outcomes in 1 or 2 years in which we can go back to our bosses and say to them, look what I did for you. Now, you hope that 1 or 2 year outcome that you're getting is a function of a long-term view, but it's often a function of a short-term view. So there's a misalignment between the temperament of the owner of the money and the opportunity set to compound over 20 years.
In fact, if I can add quickly, not to take over as the moderator.
Feel free. Don't need me.
I think for the listeners, a nice example is how long does it take in your work for a manager to come up with a strategy and then that that strategy gets implemented? It doesn't happen in months.
Yeah.
It takes time. And similarly with investing is really just a manifestation of what happens inside boardrooms and inside shop floors and factories and so on. And it's really no different. And so I think when you look at the investment side and sort of maybe perceive it to be this quick win, it's really you mischaracterizing what it is and what it's actually all about. Yes, there are people who claim to trade, and you'll hear somebody who says, well, listen, I bought this and sold this and I made this much money. What they don't tell you is that they've lost a whole ton of money before they got to that trade. And it gives the illusion that they're always winning. But they maybe won once out of the 9 times that they've tried it, which is the survivorship bias that we were talking about earlier.
We're talking to Krish Gopaul, the Chief Investment Officer and Principal at First Avenue Investment Management, and Asanda Noche, Chief Investment Officer at Mazi Asset Management tonight. Investment School in session, managing market volatility. 9 minutes to 8.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, pioneering cash management solutions for our clients, as honored by Euromoney Cash Management Survey 2024.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Asanda Noche, Chief Investment Officer at Mazi Asset Management. Krish Gopaul, Chief Investment Officer Principal at First Avenue Investment Management. 011 88 30702 021 446 0567. Investment School in session tonight around managing market volatility. One of the most interesting questions that's come out recently is around the two-pot system. So you can now access some of your pension money. What do you do with it? And Asanda, we're all very worried that people are spending it. It's a very interesting question around whether some people might be taking it out to invest or taking it out to invest in paying back debt.
Yeah, so I think the concept around investing for your retirement is inherently a long-term investment exercise, because you're investing for a period, you're investing in your future. And so the taking and moving forward some of that money and taking it out now does then raise that question. But I think to the extent that, you've got then, let's say, and maybe to put listeners at ease, to the extent that you've got expensive debt, which is effectively doing the negative of investing for the long term, there is then, I guess, justification. Of course, the proviso is that money goes from the bank account to the debt and not via a retailer, a favored retailer of some sort,
yes.
On its way, and in fact doesn't actually get to that. So again, it's all maybe part of looking at your investment portfolio from a long-term perspective and saying, well, yes, I can have this money sitting in my pension fund, but actually I've got this really, really burning debt that's actually probably reducing and eroding my wealth in the long term. Maybe I can use this opportunity to do that. But again, you are taking from your future, and so use it wisely.
Krish, there's another point about what happens when the information that you have changes. When events change, you can't just stick with the same strategy. You have to be prepared, as painful as it can be, to change your mind.
Yeah, I think John Maynard Keynes said that. If events change, I change my mind too. The proviso is obviously it has to be something that's material. Again, it comes with experience to know what is material, but it has to be material to your investment case. And the way you go about thinking about it is you say, is this simply a discomforting experience that I'm seeing? Is this discomforting information, or is it disconfirming thesis? So if it's disconfirming of the knowledge that you gathered when you invested, then you change. If it's if it's discomforting, well, you live with it until it's disconfirming. And the period of discomforting sometimes can throw many people off, and they act on impulse.
So in other words, you've got to be sure.
Oh, you have to be as sure as your investment thesis was. It's all in your investment thesis. It's just what you thought and what you've learned along the way. if that is disconfirmed, then you are wrong. You just have to admit it, I was wrong. But you have to live with a certain amount of discomfort, which is the purpose of this discussion we're having. Is there's so much uncertainty, there's volatility, it's discomforting. It's not disconfirming of the fact that still equity markets return the best amount of returns that you find relative to bonds, property, money market, and cash, and so on. It doesn't disconfirm that, it's just discomforting.
There's another point, I suppose. I mean, some things, it seems, you can see which way trends are going. So sometimes they call them mega trends. Sometimes we don't spot them. Sometimes we do. So you could take as much money as you want and throw it at artificial intelligence, and you should end up rich. Would go the theory. Yeah. Or energy management. And Asanda, I mean, this is important. You do need to check the right sector. I don't know if I would put that much money into British American tobacco if they're not moving to vapes, if you see what I mean, because trends are changing. Artificial intelligence is where everyone's putting their money. There's so much of it that it's doing all sorts of crazy things. The point is you've got to pick your sector. Absolutely. And I think that's where, fundamental research, I suppose, is quite critical in really understanding what are those mega trends, what are the things that are likely to have an impact, in the world that we live in. I often say to my kids, if they go into school, think about what the kids, if you wanted to start a business at school, think about what the kids would want to buy. So is there, this is a very bad example, don't do it at home, but is there the prime drink at school? That terrible. Terrible. So to the extent that kids want to buy prime, and hopefully, and I'm just giving an example, everyone, find a way then to offer prime outside the gates of the school. So that's a business, you're offering a service. But if you think about, again, just making some more examples. So you spoke about, AI, but another trend, 60/60 is all over our roads. So e-commerce is taken over by storm. So whereas previously we would have gone to macro to go buy, our stock of long life milk. Now we go onto 60/60, we buy it. So that's a mega trend. That's something that is having a fundamental impact on the way that we do something on a daily basis. And I think lastly, the sustainability of the trend is also quite important. You can't just have the lemonade stand, needs to do deliveries too. Asanda Noche, thank you so much. Chief Investment Officer at Mazi Asset Management. Clelo Giyose, Chief Investment Officer and Principal at First Avenue Investment Management on Investment School on The Money Show.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, pioneering cash management solutions for our clients, as honored by Euromoney Cash Management Survey 2024.
Thanks for being with us tonight. We're hoping we'll have a response from City Power tomorrow. Otherwise, it'll be next week. Look after yourself.